In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the upper control arm on the front of this GMC Yukon. After finishing this repair, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle. Let's get started. Take a 22mm socket and remove all 6 of your lug nuts. With those off, remove the wheel. I want to unplug and remove the ABS wire from this upper control arm. And the reason I want to unplug it is so that I have enough slack in the wire when I pull the knuckle down. You can see the connector located right here next to your brake line. The red tab here is a locking tab that you'll have to push backwards. Sometimes you'll need a pocket screwdriver to help you out. There we go. Now, with that unlocked, you should be able to press on the locking tab for it and pull it off. So if you slide that forward, you'll be able to see it better, and then you can disconnect it. Leave this over there. On the control arm, it has a bracket that secures onto the brake hose here. I'm going to try and pry this retainer off, set this aside this way, and let's take the 10mm bolt off of that brake hose bracket. Pull this off. Next, let's take the tie rod off of the knuckle. Use a 21mm socket, remove the mounting nut. Okay, you can see for me, the tie rod popped out of the knuckle, which is great, but that's also causing it to spin the stud, not just the nut. I'm gonna push it down, see if that helps. Looks like it does not. If this happens to you, the only way to fix it is to put a wrench on the nut and a 10mm socket on the stud. Turn them against each other, and that should unthread the mounting nut from the stud. Okay, get this off of here. And of course, if yours was still stuck in the knuckle, you would have been able to take the mounting nut off directly. But also at this point, you'd have to unseize it. You can tap the stud upwards this way. Just be careful not to hit the threads. You do have quite a bit of space here before you do hit the threads to make sure you don't mushroom it. Or you could use a special stud remover, tie rod end remover, which is kind of like a fork that pinches down on this and pushes this up. You want to avoid hammering on the knuckle with a steel hammer because it's an aluminum knuckle. Pull this off, use a 36mm socket and remove the axle nut. If you don't have a powerful air gun like this, you can break it free with a pry bar between the lug studs and holding the pry bar, breaking the axle nut free. There's also a washer behind here that we have to remove. At this point, you want to make sure that the axle pushes through. You can see this one does. If this doesn't happen to you, you want to put a center punch here and just tap it with a hammer. Make sure you don't smash the threads, or you could also put the axle nut flush back on and then use a hammer directly on that. But I'm good to go here. It can easily move in and out. From behind the knuckle now, since you can freely turn it, you'll see this 18mm mounting nut that is for the upper ball joint. So the only way you can get to this at this point is with a wrench. Put a wrench on it. It shouldn't be crazy tight. Just break it free, and you're going to want to remove it pretty much all the way at this point. Brake hose is going to be somewhat in your way. Just be careful not to damage it. If the studs start spinning on you, there is a cutout for an Allen socket in there. Hopefully we don't have to use that though. I also sprayed everything with rust penetrant so that it helps the threads slide a little bit easier. If your threads are extra rusty, consider wire brushing them. That usually helps, especially when you're using hand tools like this. Okay, the mounting nut is off. I will leave it on just a few threads. Now I will use a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer, and tap the knuckle, paying attention to my brake hose, not to smash this completely, but I want to tap the knuckle, which will hopefully break this free. And the reason I'm leaving the nut on here is so that when it does break free, the control arm doesn't come flying out and the knuckle flying forward. All right, here we go. Rubber mallet, not steel hammer. Hopefully this breaks free. And you want to pay attention to this brake hose that you don't actually smash it while you're doing this. There we go, that popped off. Now using a pry bar that goes in between the control arm and the spring, pull the control arm down, remove this mounting nut, and slowly lift the control arm up. There we go. Now with the knuckle coming forward, make sure that ball joint comes out and make sure the axle pushes through. There we go. We can leave this here at this point. Make sure the ABS wire is safely out of your way. Now the upper control arm is held on with 2 adjustable bolts. On one side you'll see a 21mm nut that we have to remove, and this will apply to both ends. I'm only showing you one right now. I'll show you the other one in a minute. The other side of the bolt you only have to hold on to. So it's actually right here near the spring. You don't have to turn that. Well, you can't turn it actually, because the bolt side or the bolt head will actually spin these adjusters. I'll show you in a second what I mean. So for now, let's put a 21mm socket on the nut side and hold the bolt head with a 21 wrench. There we go, put that right there. 21mm socket on here. Break this free. I also sprayed these with rust penetrant. You should do the same if yours are rusty. It usually helps. I'm just going to remove this nut completely at this point. Take this off and set it aside. What you'll notice now is if you want to spin the bolt, it'll actually spin the whole control, or move the whole control arm, I should say. Okay, so our bolt moves. That's great, because that means it's not seized inside the control arm. You should be able to tap the bolt out now. Let's pull this off. Okay, set that aside. As you tap the bolt out, it'll come in through where the spring is. Now, if you cannot clear the spring, you're going to want to loosen up the other side first, and then you can actually adjust the control arm in and out a little bit so that you can hopefully clear the spring. In order to not damage any threads, I'm going to put this mounting nut on a little bit and use this as a tapping point, basically. Hopefully yours doesn't come out with this much difficulty. I'm going to continue using my air chisel to basically push this bolt out. A lot of times these do get very rusted in there, sometimes even seize inside the control arms. There it is. Here's the bolt. I'm gonna clean this up and inspect it. I already see an area that I don't like, which is these threads right here, so I may need to replace it. It is very important that these are structurally sound. And if you are doing this job and don't have any bolts at this point, if you see any damage, you're going to want to source new bolts before you continue. Having said this, I'm going to remove the other side before I decide exactly what I'm going to do. You can see the front is set up exactly the same, so let's do the same. Okay, there we go. Let's punch this bolt out. Put this mounting nut back on so I can have an area to hit on. Pull this off. This is going to have to slide inward towards the control arm mounting point, just so I can clear the spring. Move the control arm a little bit if necessary. That sometimes frees up the bolt. And there you go. Take this out. We're going to inspect this one too. It looks a little bit better, but we'll know once we clean it. Now you can take this and pull it right out. There's your control arm. Now that I cleaned both of my bolts up, degreased, and I put them through the wire wheel so that they are as clean as they'll get, I can tell that they are both actually perfectly reusable. Now, if yours are not, like I said earlier, I strongly recommend getting new ones, and that is because this is a safety item. Obviously, you want that control arm to stay attached to the frame. So, I'm going to reuse mine. Once again, if you have to replace yours, go ahead and do so. Now grab your new control arm, slide it into the frame. If you need to clean up the areas where it mounts, I just wiped it down with a rag. Use a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer, to tap it in. If you only have a steel hammer, just be very careful because you don't want to bend any of this metal. Also, when you tap, don't tap on the ball joint. I'm tapping on the end of the control arm right here, where the ball joint actually fits into. Just trying to line it up with the frame so we can send those bolts right through. The better you line it up, the easier it is to put the bolts in, obviously. I lathered the bolts in grease. I strongly recommend you do the same, especially if your vehicle lives in an environment that makes it rust quickly. Now, these plastic caps that are on the cams here, you can leave on. These are from the factory, so if your vehicle has already had control arms done, it may not even have them anymore, because the alignment professional will have to remove these to get the alignment within spec. I like to leave them on because it will be up to them whether they remove them or whether somehow the alignment is already spot on. Unlikely, because once you're altering suspension setup, you have to realign it. However, like I said, I will leave it up to the alignment professional. So now that this one's on, I'm going to bottom out the mounting nut just by hand so it doesn't move the bolt around. Now let's line up the other one. Make sure your adjuster actually lines up with the tab here. Looks like I have mine backwards. Make sure it faces up, kind of like swoops up, not down. So to fix that, I'm going to take it out, flip it over, and now it's facing the right way. If you don't put it the right way, what's going to happen is there will not be enough of an adjustment in the while laying the adjustment point for a proper alignment. Let's get this one on. Grab my 21mm wrench just so I can move this around and get this to fit. There we go. Tighten up the mounting nut. Now, in order to correctly torque this down, because these bushings are going to be clamped down, you're going to want to torque it at ride height. Obviously, we can't put the car on the ground right now. Everything's taken apart. So what you're going to want to do is estimate ride height. The way I do that is I just stick a pry bar in here and kind of gauge where the control arm is sitting, estimate where it would be if the vehicle was on the ground with the suspension loaded, as in with the weight of the vehicle on the suspension. So I'm going to put my pry bar right here. This is basically estimating ride height. If you don't get it exactly how it's supposed to be, that's okay. You just have to get it very close. If you don't, if you torque it like this, for example, well, the bushings are going to be basically in a bind the whole time you're driving around. So I'm going to put this in here just like that. And now I'm going to tighten both of these mounting bolts. Now, there are two designs. If you're reusing your original bolts with the tapered end to them, you're going to want to torque them to 140 foot-pounds. If you are using the new design bolt, which actually has a flat end on it, I happen to have one here so I can show you, this one gets torqued to only 77 foot-pounds. So keep that in mind. If you're using the flat end, new design bolt, 77. If you're reusing the originals, 140 foot-pounds. I'm reusing originals, so 140 foot-pounds it is. Holding the bolt side with my wrench, I'm going to snug this up by hand first, because that way I can remove my pry bar and get this out of my way when I actually go to torque it. All right, so that's nice and tight. Now, with one tightened, I can safely remove my pry bar. The control arm will stay at that height. And now I'm just going to quickly tighten this one up so that this one gets snugged. And then it's time to grab the torque wrench. Once you snug these, there is no need to continue holding the bolt side, unless for some reason it wants to spin, but it shouldn't. Now let's get the knuckle up here. To do that, I'm going to use a pry bar on the upper control arm to pry it down. I'm going to get this ready. Have the mounting nut ready, the one that goes on the upper ball joint. Make sure you don't pinch the ABS wire. Grab the knuckle, line up the knuckle with the ball joint stud. Use the pry bar to pry this down. Just like that. And with it held down like that, start the ball joint nut on, and as soon as it does, just bring it up as many threads as you can. Now you can let go, and the control arm is temporarily safely secured. Continue to pry down on the ball joint nut and use your 18mm wrench to tighten this up. If the stud starts spinning on you, you can just put extra pressure with the pry bar. Whoop, spinning the knuckle. All right. As soon as it starts spinning the knuckle like this, we can just go to the other side, which we could have done from the beginning, but for me it was easier to start it with my right hand. As you tighten this, keep in mind that the torque for it is 37 foot-pounds and 100 degrees. So because we're unable to fit a torque wrench in here, I don't have anything that'll fit. I'm just going to make it as tight as I can by hand. What you also can do, since this is a locking nut, you can put a little bit of grease on the top of the threads there. That'll remove some of the friction, as well as on the flange of the nut. That'll also remove some of the friction, and you can more easily tighten it by hand. All right, that should be nice and tight. Let's get the axle nut back on. I'm going to put the washer on first, and then the mounting nut itself. And I'm going to start it on with the air gun, but as you'll notice, I'm going to stop right as it bottoms out because I don't want to tighten it with a power tool. I want to torque it by hand so that I don't over tighten that bearing and cause it to fail prematurely. Now I'm going to stick a long pry bar through the studs here. Make sure it's not at an angle so you don't damage the threads. And then I can use my torque wrench to torque it. The torque for this axle nut is 188 foot-pounds. I have my pry bar through the studs, 188 foot-pounds. There it is right there. Perfect. If you have a lot of greasy fingerprints on your rotors, go ahead and wipe these off with a clean rag and some brake parts cleaner. You don't want any grease on this surface. There we go. That was quite dirty. Now a lot of this stuff that's smearing is brake dust from the inside part here, so that's fine. I'm just trying to get the grease off. Now take your tie rod end, put it through the knuckle, put the mounting nut on, snug it up, 21mm socket. If this happens, just press down on the tie rod end. That should lock that stud in. There we go. Now once it's bottomed out, the torque for it is 26 foot-pounds, so it's really not that high. I'm probably already there. Yep, there we go. Let's get the brake hose bracket resecured. Put that 10mm headed bolt back in and snug it up. Once you get it nice and snug, resecure the ABS wire right into this bracket. Make sure the retainer actually locks in. If there's any sand in these connectors, go ahead and get it out of there. Click these two back together, lock that red tab, and then if you took it off of this retainer, slide it right back. That's locked in. Let's get the wheels back on. Put on all 6 of your lug nuts, and then in a cross pattern, torque them to 140 foot-pounds. $140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Here we go. And it's always a good idea to double check them. This time you don't have to go in a cross pattern though. All right, now take it for a road test and of course, get an alignment.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.